So I recently came across a post from the founder of a Nigerian fintech startup called Helicode, where he was talking about the problem Nigerian remote workers and freelancers face when receiving money from abroad. The argument was essentially that someone could be paid $1,000 by an international employer or client, but after the fees and friction involved in getting that money into Nigeria, they might end up with only $950. So essentially, they lose $50. And according to the LinkedIn post, Helicode wants to solve that problem in an interesting way. Does it make sense, or is the model flawed from the beginning? Let's find out. Today's episode is called The Payment Problem Debacle. Now, before I go any further, let me be clear. The problem of cross border payments is real. Sending money across countries can be expensive. There can be exchange rate spreads, transfer fees, intermediary charges, settlement delays, and other forms of friction. But I found the post interesting because I worked remotely for a US company for about 2 years. Now let's assume that my salary was $2,000 a month. When that payment was made, what I received was $1,982. So I lost about $18 for receiving $2,000, not $50, $18. For most of the time I was receiving the money, the Clever charge was so Clever was the payment service I used. So the Clever charge was approximately 0.9%. Today, that charge is down to about 0.8%. So let's apply that to the example of $1,000 payment. At 0.8%, you lose about $8. You receive approximately $992. Now, maybe there are payment methods where someone loses $50. I'm not saying that's impossible. But when we say a Nigerian remote worker is paid $1,000 but only receives $950, we need to ask, is that actually representative of the market? Because if the average person is losing $50, that's one business opportunity. If the average person is losing $8, that's a very different one. And that's where I think we need to start. This is something I think startups often get wrong. They identify the most painful version of a problem and then present it as though it represents the entire market. But the question isn't, can someone lose $50 receiving $1,000 from abroad? Of course they can. But the question is, how much is the average person actually losing and how many people are losing it? Because a problem can be real and still not be big enough to build a business around. Let's say you have a market of 1 million remote workers. Every single one of them is losing $50 every month. That's a massive problem. But if most people are losing $5 or $8 for every $1,000, and some people are losing $50 because they are using expensive payment methods, then the opportunity looks very different. And this is why I think the framing matters. You don't build a business around the biggest possible example of a problem. You build it around the typical experience. Now, maybe Helicode has data showing that the $50 figure is common. If so, fair enough. But from my own experience, I know that receiving money from an international employer does not necessarily mean losing 5% of the payment. In my case, it was less than 1%. And today, using the same basic calculation, 0.8% of $1,000 is just $8. So the first question for me is this actually a big enough problem? Because if you're trying to build a business around reducing payment friction, the amount of friction matters. Reducing a $50 loss to $5 is a compelling value proposition. Reducing an $8 loss to $3, now that's a much harder business. And then we get to the part of this model that I find even more interesting, the question of who pays. So I saw someone ask in the comments, how do you plan to make money? And the founder responded that they plan to charge the employer, that's the international employer. Now, this is where I started to have serious doubts about the model. Now, let's imagine I get a new remote job with a US company. The company says, we'll pay you $1,000 per month. They then ask me, where should we send the money? At that point, I provide them with my payment details. I can choose a dollar account, I can choose a fintech service, I can choose another payment provider, I can choose whatever legitimate option gives me the best outcome. The employer has agreed to pay me $1,000. The employer sends me $1,000. Case closed. If I choose a payment method that charges me $50, that is my problem. If I find another method that charges me $8, I have solved the problem. So why should the employer be charged an additional $50? The employer can quite reasonably say, I agree to pay you $1,000. I am paying you $1,000. Find the most efficient way to receive it. And honestly, I think that's a perfectly reasonable position because the employer doesn't necessarily care how you receive the money. They could send it to your bank account. They could send it through a fintech. They could send it through another payment provider. In fact, if you want them to send a carrier pigeon and tie a tiny bag of money to its leg, that's up to you as the person receiving the money. If you even decide you want to send a private jet to the US from Nigeria to pick up the money, bring it back, and have somebody hand deliver it to you, the employer probably doesn't care. As long as the company has paid the $1,000 it agreed to pay, the method of delivery is largely your problem. The employer's responsibility is pay the $1,000 to the worker. Your responsibility is tell the employer the best way to do that. The person experiencing the payment friction is the worker. The worker chooses the payment destination, and the worker benefits directly from finding a cheaper payment method. So, my question is, why are you making the employer the customer in this situation? Now, some people may say the employer has more money, and that's true. But having more money doesn't mean you should pay for every problem someone else has. If I get a job paying me $1,000 a month, the employer has already decided what my work is worth. If I tell them, please pay me an additional $50 because the payment method I selected is expensive, they can simply say, why don't you use another payment method? And I think that's the key issue. The employer has already fulfilled its obligation. It agreed to pay $1,000. It pays $1,000. The worker's responsibility is to receive the money. Now, if the worker is losing $50 every month, that worker has a very strong incentive to find a better solution. But the employer may have absolutely no incentive to get involved. The employer doesn't necessarily care whether the worker uses Clever, Wise, Gray, a bank account, cryptocurrency, or any other legitimate payment rail. The employer cares that the worker is paid. So in this situation, the worker experiences the pain, controls the choice of payment method, and benefits from reducing the cost. The employer doesn't experience the pain, may not control the receiving method, and has no obvious reason to pay more. And that creates what I think is the central problem with this business model. The person with the problem is not necessarily the person with the money. But in this case, the person with the problem also has the ability to choose the solution. So why would the person who doesn't have the problem be the one paying for it? Now, to be fair, I don't think charging employers for international payment services is automatically a bad idea. There are companies that manage international workers for foreign companies, and those companies pay them for it. But they are usually solving a much bigger problem. They may handle payroll, compliance, tax documentation, contractor management, multiple currencies, reporting, reconciliation, and the administrative complexity of operating across multiple countries. In that case, the employer isn't paying so that my worker can receive $1,000. The employer is paying because they don't want to manage all of this complexity by themselves. That is a completely different value proposition. But if the proposition is simply send us an additional $50 so that your worker can receive the $1,000 you already agreed to pay them, then I think the model becomes much more difficult, because the employer can simply say, no, we agreed to pay $1,000, and the worker can find another way to receive it. This is why I think the most important questions when evaluating a startup are: who has the problem, who controls the decision, and who is willing to pay for the solution? Because those three people are not always the same. And if you confuse them, you can build a business around a problem that people acknowledge, but nobody is willing to pay you to solve. So, last words. Helicode, I genuinely wish you the best. I don't know enough about the entire product, the payment rules you're using, your actual costs, or the full details of the business model. Maybe the $50 figure is genuinely representative of a large part of the market. Maybe employers will be willing to pay for the convenience. But based on the proposition presented, I remain skeptical, because I think there are two problems. First, the size of the problem may be overstated. In my own experience, I was losing $18 on a payment of $2,000, like I said, for example. And at a 0.8% fee, a $1,000 payment results in a payment of approximately $8. Second, even if the problem is as large as presented, I'm not convinced that charging the employer is the right business model. The employer has agreed to pay you $1,000. The worker chooses how to receive it, and the worker has the strongest incentive to find the most efficient way to receive the money. Is the problem real? Yes. Is there an opportunity? Possibly. What about the size of the problem? I'm not convinced. And regarding the business model, I am very skeptical, because a real problem is not automatically a business opportunity. You need to know how painful the problem is, how frequently it occurs, what alternatives already exist, who controls the decision, and most importantly, who is willing to pay. Because sometimes the problem is real, the solution may even be better, but the person you're trying to charge may simply say, why is this my problem? And if that's the answer, you may have a business model problem.